We talked about the subcultures, state-wise languages people stick together in the West, Indians. Then we talked about the different faiths. We went on to the Indian Christians as well in the UK, USA, and the Anglosphere as a whole. And then I would just like to touch on an interesting side of all of this, and it's related to caste. And you know, we were always sensitive to the caste structure. It's a very old structure in India and in the West. You now have the CEO of Google, Sundar Pichai, as an Indian. The CEO of Microsoft is an Indian. The CEO of IBM is an Indian. I think before Elon Musk came along, the CEO Parag Agrawal was the Twitter CEO, and I think Oracle and others as well. Can you explain how this tech industry affected, or rather had an impact on the caste system of India?
Yeah, I think Indian society has been social stratification is along the lines of caste.
Right.
Caste also determines, what profession that you had to do. It also limited education. Education was largely available to the Brahminical learned class, and who tend to rule and dominate other castes. So what the tech revolution did in India, in some way, was democratizing and providing access for this new knowledge, know-how, especially computer skills and engineering schools. And so when I think it was goes back to, I trace that back to in mid-70s, there was an Indian mathematician physicist, astrophysicist. He wins Nobel Prize. It just kind of shocked the world. And this kind of talent exists in India. India had long history of mathematics.
Yeah.
It has a strong sense of logic. So India produces large share of the engineers every year. So all that stems from that mathematical orientation. Here is a gentleman who goes to America, higher education, 60s, advanced education. All that was largely available to the learned class. And but then he wins Nobel Prize. So the American academia suddenly sees that, hey, there is really good talent, scientific and mathematical and engineering skills available in India. And so they started heavily recruiting people from India. And so that happens in the 80s. And by 90s, what happened in America and the worldwide computer industry goes through a crisis, often called as Y2K. And computers were crashing. By the turn of the millennium, everything is going to go crazy.
That craze was there.
So within a few months, they needed thousands and tens of thousands of engineers to recode all the codes that they've done over the last few decades. And because of these, some of the engineers and business people in the tech industry, they immediately tapped into the thousands of engineers from India to come and help them. So Indians proved their mettle through Y2K crisis. And they averted that crisis. India had played a major role, Indian engineers. And so that really opened the floodgates, the American tech industry, to hire and recruit a record number of Indians. And I was part of that revolution. I came to America in the 90s, worked in the tech industry, in the leadership. So we started recruiting large number. We created back office operation, research centers in India, invested technology in India, technology companies. So Microsoft and IBM and Oracle and all of them started companies back in India. And so they were back office operation, 24/7 cycle.
Right.
So the time zone difference of India and the US also greatly aided this 24/7 work cycle. And so I'll finish the work, hand it over to my team in India. Team will work in India, they will hand it over to me when I come back to work in the morning. So people were working on the project continuously. So there are many advantages that contributed to the rise of the technology boom in India. Very high-paying jobs was available suddenly in India. But it's also trickled down across the caste line. Many from the lower caste was able to access education. they'll go for a 6 months or a 1 year computer training, and then was getting hired by multinational companies, and they were making 20 times, 40 times the salary. And so suddenly opportunities exploded, and Indians started getting hired. And so this wave at the grassroots level, coding and engineers, also created the swell or the goodwill towards Indians.
Right.
And by middle of 2010 or so, we're seeing the senior leadership recognizing this talent and hiring the best of the best. But the first wave was largely high caste, highly educated, professional, from a Hindu background, Brahmin faith, who had access to education to the best schools in India.
Yeah.
They went to the best schools in America. They got hired to these great technology companies. This groundswell with the tech revolution, they just rose to the top positions in India.
Yeah.
They become wealthy, stock options, high-tech industries. They contributed greatly, turned around.
Yeah.
The companies like Microsoft, Google, new push that brought in lots and lots of people. But it's also, there are a lot of other caste folks are also risen in leadership. So there are a lot of software companies, many of them have from a lower caste who could never think of, have started companies, and they've gone public and they got bought over and become millionaires.
Fascinating. It's fascinating.
Billionaires now.
Yeah, it's fascinating because this is for another time, but because I want to move on with more. But when a lower caste person in India, if let's say they're a Dalit or outside of the caste system, because of the caste system and the rule of concept of karma, they just believe they're destined to clean the gutters, take the dead dogs out of the village and put them in the outskirts, or do all those kind of tasks. So they're told by their dad, this is your karma, this is your caste, this is what you do. And you take them out of that caste, even though India has a secular constitution, but the society is still caste, you're struck past caste based, understandably so. But when you take them out of that and you put them in a secular country like America or UK, where there's a Judeo-Christian kind of approach where all men are created equal in the image of God, and they suddenly think, oh wow. And you've got a Dalit think tank in New York City. I just can't conceive that, because when I was a monk in the temple in India, someone waved to me from the outside gate, and I said, you can come in. Come in. He goes, I can't come in. I said, why can't you come in? He really gentle face, said, come in. He goes, no, I can't. I said, why can't you come in? I'm asking you to come in. He said, I'm a Dalit. I'm not even allowed in the temple compound. It's just fascinating how education, that the missionaries pushed for in India, that went to the lower caste, and then these industries in a Judeo-Christian framework sort of supported the lower caste people to rise and to, as you say, become billionaires. It's just something you could never have thought of some decades ago.
Even they themselves could not imagine.
Yeah.
They could generate so much wealth.
Yeah.
And be so successful.
Yeah.
And just because the knowledge, they got an engineering degree from India, and then American university just brings them because they are an engineer, and then get their masters and PhDs, and they go to invent things and climb up the economic ladder.
It's inconceivable.
Inconceivable in the Indian civilizational value.
Yeah.
Because when you're destined to certain jobs and certain livelihood and certain place and certain income levels, and now you're liberated from that bondage to the place and the social location and economic achievement.
It's incredible.
And so migration creates that. Once you're displaced, you're in another land, you don't think the way you thought, or you were forced to think back in your ancestral home.
Yeah, there's also a study in India done by our good friend Atul Agamkar, that when people move away from the village or even their family home, they are more open in India to explore other faiths as well. They tend to be more open in that as well.
That's the interesting thing about diaspora studies and diaspora mission is so many people of Hindu, Sikh, Jain background have embraced and become followers of Jesus in foreign lands.
Right.
It is primarily because your family, your community, your pressure from your society does not exist.
Right.
You're open to the
open
gospel.
to the gospel.
Open to the person of Jesus
Right.
appears very different.
Yeah.
Rather than through the Western culturalized notion within India.
Yeah.
So that is, I think, the opportunity for us to understand our faith in a new way. I compare and contrast my Hindu Jain beliefs against my faith of my friend. And so when I compare and contrast, certain things stand out. Certain things looks very silly.
Yeah.
And in the midst of that, Christianity as a global faith, Jesus asks us allegiance to him as a person.
Yes.
And him as the one who's died for you. So there is something very appealing about the person of Jesus and what Jesus has accomplished on the cross, across cultures, across ethnicity and nationality. And it is not becoming an English Christian or American Christian.
Yeah.
You are becoming a follower of Jesus.
And very Indian at the same time.
He's very Asian and Indian.
Yeah.
And if you read the story of Jesus, it just speaks to an Indian heart.
Yeah, the culture is very similar to Indian culture. When you look at biblical culture, it's so identical. So Sam, in the first session, we covered the overall condition of the Indian diaspora. In session 2, we looked at the different subcultures so that we're aware of what we're engaging with and who we're engaging with. You know, Indian doesn't mean everyone is the same. Different faiths, different languages, different, obviously, socioeconomic status. Just want to sort of now move into the challenges as well as the opportunities that we have with this influx of Indians coming from India, because the UK is going to see a huge student influx.
That's right.
Due to the India-UK free trade deal. And we're already seeing in the UK huge numbers of Indian students that are most likely going to take over the total number of the Chinese students in UK universities by the end of next year, most likely. So what are the challenges? What are the opportunities? You travel a lot. You probably know more Indian Christians in the UK than I do, your different Indian churches. And can you just shed some light on that?
Yeah, I would say that, we are living in some exciting times. And what lay ahead is probably beyond any of our past experiences or what we have known. It took British forced migration, indentured labor to take 2 million people who were bound to the land. And from 47 to 2020, we added another 55 million or so people who live outside of Indian subcontinent. And now in the next 30 years,
right,
and that is 2050 or so, we are projecting another 100 million Indians will move out of India.
Another 100?
Another 100 million.
On top of the current 60?
Current, yeah. So this is unprecedented.
Yeah.
And this level of out-migration.
It's like twice the population of the UK.
Yeah, I know.
Right.
So this is all over the world. They're not just coming to England.
Yeah.
But the idea is what is happening. I think we are entering into an era of hyper-migration. Massive out-migration is going to happen. Again, forecasting migration is a very tricky thing. Some of us who study migration, we are involved in forecasting and trying to see socioeconomic issues, political issues, war, everything else, and who is pushing out, who is pulling. So the push-pull factors of many countries and the regions we study closely with the realities of economics and political and the policies and all of that. So we are projecting 100 million by 2050. More people will leave India for a couple of reasons. One, India is an English-speaking nation, largest, as we said earlier. Second is also India is a very young country. And more than half of the population is below the age of 30.
Yeah.
So these are college age. The 25 again and under, that population is very high. Adolescent population is very high as compared to any country in the world.
The average age of an Indian is 28.
Yes.
And the population is now 1.4?
1.4. We become the largest, most populous nation in the world. We crossed China.
This year?
Yeah, this year. And it's a very youthful country.
Yeah.
And so that will go. And I think in the last 20 years, one sector that has really pushed people out is the tech industry.
Right.
And then the business and, MBAs and engineers
Medicine
and science
too.
and medicine and law and all of these professionals. And large number of them will go abroad. And they will send in money back home to help their family. India earns the largest remittance in the last 10 years, year after year. World Bank tracks 89 billion dollars a year.
Sent back to India.
2020. So large amount of money flows back to India. That has become kind of a mainstream of the Indian economic activity. And the states like Gujarat and Punjab and Kerala, that is like the staple, the most important revenue source for the annual state budgets.
Yes.
And so they're closely monitoring that, and that has been a source of revenue. It is more than the aid or foreign help that we receive. So remittance has become a major...
So Indians giving back to India.
India, in many ways. But they're also contributing through taxes and gains in the host countries. Because being highly educated professional group in North America, they're involved in policy making. They are serving the community, serving in politics. We have a vice president who is of Indian origin. She's father was a Jamaican, Caribbean, mother was a Tamil, Indian, and she is now the vice president of the country.
Right.
And now we have entering into another political cycle, and we have a couple of candidates already in the presidential race. So we are seeing they are active in politics, active in business, active in social sector.
It's similar in the UK, active in politics,
Yeah,
business.
we have a prime minister and we have business community active, and they give back a lot to the community and contribute to the social well-being, and sometimes their own people, or they back people back home, and they also serve other communities
right.
As their need arises. Then they serve through their healthcare needs, and they run charity healthcare affair and provide medicines and provide free services to the community who can't afford, especially in America, healthcare crisis. It's not like a nationalized health services in America. So they, because of the healthcare know-how and experience and access that they have, they provide a lot of services to the disadvantaged and marginalized communities. So immigrants contribute more to the economy than they take away. And sometimes we don't understand that dynamics of it. And they also help the faith because they revive the faith. Because I often say that, Christianity is not native to America. Jesus did not come to America or England.
Yeah.
And Christian faith was brought to our land and to this land, even India. Christianity was brought there. It was brought by missionaries, or they're brought by migrants. And America, when I say America, I'm an American citizen. America is a land of immigrant. And American Christianity is immigrant Christianities from different parts of the world. So Europeans came. Europeans came in the form of Germans, English people, Scottish people, Swedish people, Dutch people. They all brought their respective faith to America. That was one wave. Then we brought the African American slave wave. Nevertheless, whatever the condition is, large number of them become Christians or were Christians already. And so we see the African American wave. Now we see the Latin American. There are 62 million Latinos in America. That's a significant wave. And then the Asians. Asians are so dominant, especially Koreans, Chinese, Filipinos, Indians. There are so many Christians among them. And back in Korea, maybe 1/3 of Korea is Christians. But in America, 80% of them are Christians.
Right.
And they have some 10,000 churches.
In America?
In America. Korean churches.
So,
And now the National Association of Evangelical is headed by a Korean.
right.
So they're so dominant in presence, and they're contributing and engaged with the larger Christian community. So wave after wave of migration has brought unique strains of Christian faith and culturalized Christianity from different shores of the world. So it's like a river. Every stream adds new vitality and vigor to that faith and the stream.
That's an opportunity there.
It's a great opportunity.
Right.
It's a great opportunity.
So what would you say would be now the challenge of, let's look at the Indian Christian diaspora.
Yeah, I would say the challenge in the English context right now that I'm hearing repeatedly.
In the UK or?
In the UK.
Okay.
It's, in a way, we have talked about this in the US also in the last decade or so.
Yeah.
But 1947 onwards, we have a longer cycle of migration into UK. We had streams from Caribbeans and East Africa besides India. India was an older stream from 40s and 50s than America. So it is a little more complicated in the UK story.
Right.
Because there are many subgroups within these groups. But I think if you look at the Indian community in England, I think nearly half of them are British born.
The Christian Indian.
No, all
yes.
British folks.
Yeah.
And so that means as many immigrants, as many people who are here. So the next generation, second generation or third generation is a challenge. We haven't decisively. For the first generation, we have created Gujarati churches, Malayali churches, Tamil churches. We are doing, because language, there's a cohesive force that brings them together.
Yeah.
But with the second, third generation, they lose the language. But they're still Indian,
yes.
or Gujarati, or Malayali, or Keralites, but they lose the language. And that creates a crisis, an inability to affiliate and enjoy and associate
a service
done in that particular language and that culture. They might have cultural affinity. I might still love that Kerala food and the Tamil, sambars and dosas, but language-wise, I lost the Tamil or Malayali or Punjabi.
Right.
And so I think that creates a crisis of faith for the next generation. So how can churches minister to the British-born and raised generation? Somebody who speaks with British accent, all of that.
And I guess also they don't have the questions that the elder generation of Christians had. So the elder generation of Christians probably had questions along the lines of culture or language. How do we maintain this? How we maintain that? How we stay connected to India? Whereas the new generation, they don't have those questions. They have questions. These Indian Christians have questions around maybe gender or the current culture wars that are taking place in our country and in the West at large. So I guess addressing that is also...
It's a big challenge for the immigrant church. We have around 120 churches now.
In the UK.
Indian churches in the UK.
In the UK. How many in the US?
Around 1,500.
1,500 US.
Around 1 million Christians. 20% of Indian Americans are Christians. And they're spread over some 1,500 churches in every state.
In every state.
Every state of US.
And here is 120 churches.
120
Indian
churches. Indian churches.
And they are largely Kerala churches, South Indian?
A lot of them are Keralites.
South Indian.
Nearly 40-50% of them are Kerala churches. But there are Tamil, Gujarati, Hindi services, Punjabi services, and what else? Mangalorean service.
We need to now address or help rather the younger generation who are no longer speaking that language and so they don't affiliate with that service style per se and address the questions that they have. That's a really interesting point.
Sometimes immigrant churches become siloed. They're inward looking among themselves. They don't build those relationships with the host culture and the host churches.
Right.
There may be an English church across the street.
Right.
They think themselves as different from them and they don't associate with them at all. But your children are becoming more like their children. They're asking the same questions and struggling through the similar issues.
Because that's where they start school.
So they're assimilating. They are going to school together, they're working together, living together, or getting married together and having... so that level of mainstreaming is happening with the next generation. But the first generation is backward looking, back to ancestral home. They're looking for connections back home.
They're keeping it all insular. Keeping it as it is.
But the subsequent generation is trying to seek connections with the host culture. Because I'm British, I'm English, I'm here. This is where my life and this is all I have known.
True, that's true.
So the reference point has shifted. From India to England. That cultural reference shift we need to accommodate. They're asking different questions. Their cultural context is different. Languages change. Even if I know English, the American English is different from the Indian English.
Yes.
British English is different. You need to have the accent. Somebody is preaching. I need to have the British accent and speak in that. And use the language the way British...
It helps.
It helps.
It's strange, but I've noticed that it does help.
If I speak with the slant like the Indian slant and Indian accent, these British or American born kids, they can't relate to that.
It's interesting.
I tell an illustration in a sermon. I have had pastors who just came from India 6 months ago. Of course, his illustration comes from back in Kerala. And these kids are wondering, what is that? So I was a youth pastor. So the kids will come up and ask me, what did the pastor say today?
Yeah.
Can you explain that? Can you?
Yeah.
So I become an interpreter for what the pastor's sermon was.
In North America?
In North America.
Right.
Because the reference point for the pastors and immigrants are, and the parents are, back in India.
But the reference point of the new generation is the West.
West, where they have grown up and where their friends are. So we need to make the shift.
Yeah.
It is both intellectual, cultural, spiritual, and is what I call from the missional language is translative.
Yeah.
We have to translate the gospel because Christian faith is a translatable faith.
Yeah.
Every culture, we enter into the culture, understand the culture, study the culture, become one among them, and speak the language.
Yeah. Yeah.
That is the Christian gospel.
No,
We have to relive it in every culture, every generation.
Just to finish off, as you're talking on the reference point, just share a little about, just very quick, about Jesus being born in the Middle East. You know, we were talking earlier outside of this session about the locality, the geography. Do you want to just share that and then we can...
Yeah, I think, I often say, in the Indian context, both in India and the Indians in the West, sometimes, this is this portrayal of Jesus as a Westerner.
Yeah.
So I often say in my graduate class to my students, Jesus was an Asian. So I have a lot of these Chinese and Korean kids saying, he's Asian? What do you mean he's an Asian? He doesn't look like us.
Yeah.
Because in America, when we say Asian, it is East Asian.
Right.
Here in England, when they say Asian, it means South Asian.
Yeah.
I have lived both in South Asia and in East Asia. I have lots of Chinese and Korean friends, both in Hong Kong and my time in Singapore. So I had this difficult battle to fight. When I'm in England, I say, when you talk British Asians, I want to invite my Chinese and Korean friends. In America, Asian American, I'll fight for South Asian to be better. If you're talking about Asian American, Asia is beyond East Asia.
Yeah.
Because Asia is a huge continent.
Yeah.
You got to be representative of all that.
You can't.
So West Asia is also, Jesus was a West Asian. He grew up in Palestine. And the coming of Jesus, the land of Israel, being at the intersection of three continents, and the gospel gains mobility along those three trajectories of the early growth of Christianity is an important story.
Yeah, which was the main trade routes as well.
Yeah.
Going back to the Persian and the Romans before the birth of that was like a crossroad point in a way for all the trade.
That's right.
Trade from India,
Africa.
China. Yeah.
So the Christianity grew to Asia and Africa before it reached Europe.
Yeah.
So that story is sometimes overlooked. And especially how Western seminaries teach theology classes. We begin with Martin Luther and, Calvin. I mean, they are great theologians. I read, I quote them. Wonderful. It helps me to understand myself. But Christianity did not begin in the 16th century in Germany or in Geneva.
Yeah.
So it's a longer track record, longer history in other parts of the world.
Yeah.
We need to be inclusive of that. So Christianity goes from Jerusalem in 1st century, goes to Antioch. Antioch was the westernmost end of the Silk Road travel all the way to Asia.
Yeah.
And we begins to Asia, to Edessa, we see moving eastward. And the furthest settlement of Jewish people in the 1st century, the time of Jesus, was India.
India, yeah.
It was in Kerala. There was a settlement in Kerala. And Apostle, this is some old historical literature where Apostle Thomas was the last one to believe in Christ. And he makes a comment that I'll go to the furthest ends of the earth to proclaim that Jesus, the Messiah, has already come and he rose again. And that's how Thomas lands up in India and brings faith to the furthest settlement of the Jewish people. So Jewish people were already there. So the Jewish diaspora, wherever the Jewish diaspora existed, that became the trajectory of expansion and the growth of Christianity. Apostle Thomas comes in AD 52, he's killed in AD 72. And thereafter the Syrian Christians helps the church in Kerala. And that's how Kerala Christians are sometimes called as Syrian Christians, because Syriac was the language of worship until 17th, 18th century.
Right.
When the Bible made available in the Malayalam language and the Tamil language, and Christianity becomes indigenized and localized, and because scripture and worship begins to happen in local languages. Until then, the sacred language was Syriac for the Kerala Christians.
In the south of India.
South of India. So the Protestant mission movement, Europe and especially William Carey's thrust on Bible in local languages. Bible become local. And that just created an explosive growth of Christianity within India, because Jesus incarnates within Indian culture, becomes one and speaks their language, and they can read scripture for themselves. That is just a powerful story of Indian Christianity.
Dr. Sam George, on that note, thank you very much for these last 3 sessions. The Indian diaspora, we covered that in good depth, the subcultures that helped us understand who we're engaging with, and finally the challenges that we face with the Indian Christians in the West, and the opportunities as well. There's lots to learn, lots to notice and be aware of. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Rahil. Great to be here, and thank you for this conversation. Appreciate all the good work that you're doing and the OCA and all the work that is coming from Oxford, and appreciate and God's blessings on you.
It was great to be with you. Thank you.
Hey guys, it's Charlie here from the OCA. Thank you so much for watching our video. I hope you found it really helpful in your search for truth. We couldn't do this without your help. In fact, the many people who get behind us financially, the people who pray for this work, all the people who put their efforts into making these videos. It takes about 60 hours for every masterclass video to go through the whole of the production process. So we just want to say a big thank you to everyone. If you want to get more involved, subscribe to our videos, or make a donation, please visit theoca.org.